Hello and welcome to the Building an Indie Business podcast with SupremeRumHam. I'm your host, Alex. Man, it is good to be recording again. I took a 3-week break from recording and it just feels good to be recording again. Alright, so this week I wanted to discuss the naming and the cover art of the podcast. I'm going to discuss why I chose to name the podcast the Building an Indie Business podcast and why I chose the cover art. But first, I wanted to discuss some general podcast things. The first thing is the Patreon page. The Patreon page, the money that goes into that will go right back into the podcast. It will support improving the podcast. So if I ever need to buy new equipment or new software, that's where the Patreon money will go. Okay. So Building an Indie Business. I chose this name because it starts with a B. And so in directories or lists of podcasts, if they use alphabetical order, my podcast would show up first, or at least be one of the first. An example of this is on Dev2. My podcast has a page on Dev2. And when you click on podcasts on Dev2, my podcast is like one of the first 10 podcasts to show up on the list. Okay. Another reason I named it Building an Indie Business is because that can easily be abbreviated to BAIB. This is mostly for Twitter or other social media for the handles. So the podcast Twitter page is BAIB podcast on Twitter. So if you guys want updates, follow it. Also, the name of the podcast says exactly what the podcast is about. There's no confusion about what this podcast is about. I'm talking about building an indie business. No VCs allowed. Okay. So, also, I named the podcast based on SEO. So, when people search for maybe indie hackers or building a business, my podcast should show up in the search results. I almost named the podcast SupremeRumHam Makes a Website, but I decided against that for the SEO reasons. Okay, now on to cover art. So the cover art is red, which is very distinct. I noticed when I was starting the podcast, or I had the idea to start the podcast, a lot of the cover arts for other podcasts were blue and black. So, in a sea of blue and black, my red cover art stands out. When you're scrolling through the list of podcasts, wherever you search for podcasts, you might stop because you see my red cover. I also chose the red cover because it matches the SupremeRumHam logo that I always use everywhere as cover, as a cover art or a logo. So if you see on my Twitter page, I have a SupremeRumHam header, and it's the same exact thing as my cover art for the podcast. Okay. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. If you have any questions, please email me srhpodcast@gmail.com. I'll put that in the show notes. You can tweet me, SupremeRumHam, on Twitter and everywhere else. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.